I'm just going to go ahead and start.
Did you have any luck getting USAP?
It just rang and rang, and they got voicemail. So,
Okay, we're recording now, and I am sharing the screen. So if he shows up, then he'll be able to see what's happening and maybe even speak. Let me just start. Okay. All right, so I would like to talk, that sounds just, oh no, that was a notification from Windows, I think. Okay, so let's just get started here. Before I introduce post-traumatic stress disorder a little bit, I'm going to talk about an author, Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a very nice book. He is Harvard trained, was on faculty at Harvard Medical School for a number of years before going to Boston University. And this book is a 2014 book. And The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. New York Times bestseller. Talks about post-traumatic stress disorder and really creates a clinical, neuroscientific, psychological, and physiological model. It goes on to look at historical, social, political aspects of the disease, and then it discusses, I didn't put this up here, but then it discusses various treatments other than pharmacology, which are also useful. And that's of interest because the pharmacological treatments are the ones that are being most heavily marketed by the medical by the medical community, including the American Psychiatric Association, and other approaches that are useful are not getting the utility. They're not being utilized to an appropriate extent, largely for political reasons, according to van der Kolk. But so what I want to do is discuss the model that van der Kolk gives, which I think in some ways is like our LIDA model in that it attempts to integrate evidence across a lot of fields. However, since we are from a computational, from an AI kind of perspective, we try to integrate it from the viewpoint of a computational perspective, and van der Kolk comes at it from a clinical perspective. And I think there's some things in common at an abstract level anyway, about the way he tries to understand PTSD and the way that we try to understand the mind in general. So anyway, I'm going to start by talking about a particular case study. There was a couple traveling from London, Ontario to Detroit in September of 1999, and I'm going to call their car 13 of 87 for reasons which will become clear in a moment. But first, things will get foggy before they become clear. They ran into a very dense patch of fog. All of a sudden, the visibility dropped to zero within a split second. The driver slammed on the brakes and narrowly missed colliding with the car in front of them. Then they, mostly in the fog, heard a long series of crashes, many of them with an impact from behind as they were buffeted and then punctuated by long periods of silence. An 18-wheeler flew over their car and landed on their trunk, crushing the trunk. They observed pedestrians fleeing from their cars, trying to escape getting hit. They observed a girl who got out of her car. She was on fire, and she ran and burned to death on their roof. On the roof of their car. During this time, the husband felt a prolonged sense of panic and thought with every car crash, the next one was going to be the one that killed them. The wife was also panicked, but she eventually kind of went into a numb and dissociated state. Now, as it turned out, a truck driver eventually appeared on the hood of their car and using a fire extinguisher, crashed through the windshield and helped them get out. And they ended up getting to the hospital and surviving with minor physical injuries. But eventually that night they were having, they couldn't sleep. They were having panic reactions. They were drinking wine to try to medicate the symptoms. And after a week or so of this, they sought medical attention for those symptoms. And eventually they were subject of a study. And of course, this was an 87 car pileup. They were car number 13, and it was the worst road disaster in Canadian history, apparently. But eventually they were part of an fMRI study that used a script-induced trauma flashback and was able to provoke the flashback from the trauma and watch their brain as they happen. And I just got a little picture here of some things in Google Images. If you Google, if you do a search on Canadian road disaster 1999, there's tons of images. And apparently I read a little online, the fire, there was basically a fireball at the center of it, and there were several cars that were fused into a giant ball of metal. But anyway, so it was a frightening experience. Probably numerous folks may have contracted post-traumatic stress disorder from that event that were fortunate enough to survive. But this one couple was studied under a brain scanner, and these are the two images. On the left is the husband, who was the driver, and on the right is the wife, who went into a dissociated state. This is them in the scanner having the feelings of the crash re-experienced as a result of reading a script. Please keep in mind that these are from the book. These are not from a journal article. The color bar and the scale on here has been set for dramatic effect. When you look at the paper and they're just looking at significant areas, it's a little less dramatic. With a different color bar setting, this would show a lot more features. But the point is that compared to baseline, there's a very dramatic dissociation during the memory of the traumatic event and a kind of a global shutdown. In this particular case, there's certain areas that are dramatically increased, as shown by the darkest would be the right amygdala. And then there's certain other areas that are much less active than normal, which are the white areas. And so we'll come back to this. I want to say a few things about post-traumatic stress disorder in general, as is defined in the DSM-5, which is a diagnostic manual for psychiatrists. There's an exposure criterion that there has to be, and I'm summarizing, but there has to be in the history of the patient an adverse event that was emotionally overwhelming in some way. And then there's a number of symptoms that have to be present in order to make the diagnosis of PTSD. One is that there are subsequent intrusive episodes that are such as flashbacks or dissociative episodes that are very emotionally distressing and impair the normal function. These episodes are typically triggered by stimuli that remind the patient of the event. Not always, but that is the typical pattern. There's avoidance behaviors where the patients have a compulsive avoidance of such stimuli. You may have known Vietnam vets that wouldn't go to war movies and so forth. But it can really become quite compulsive. Then there's, even when they're not being triggered by memories and having intrusive symptoms, there's kind of a baseline state of hypervigilance they're much more attentive for danger than, you know, someone in the baseline. And they also can have somatic symptoms where there are physical abnormalities that both of these states, hypervigilance and the somatic symptoms, is going to turn out to be related to the way the cognitive and the physiological interact in this disorder.
So, what are examples of somatic symptoms?
Just not having a normal body awareness, for instance, that would be a mild version. An extreme version would be a sexual assault victim that is unable to sense their, you know, sexual organs, you know, or perceive them normally. You're just unable to have normal awareness. And then there's also social and cognitive impairment, which is various in its manifestations, but difficulty interacting and feeling safe in normal social situations, and difficulty concentrating or learning, and the difficulties can be verbal, especially like in the social situation, but they can also involve abstract reasoning, and so there's a lot of variation here, but these are general categories that characterize kind of the range of possible presenting profiles for PTSD patients. Now this is a quote from van der Kolk, which I just want to read. It kind of, in a way, summarizes what van der Kolk claims about post-traumatic stress. We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past, it is also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. Now, in light of the way we use some of these terms, such as mind, perception, and you know, our capacity to think, and so forth, these are interesting claims. I think we'll need to look carefully at what these mean for van der Kolk to evaluate what they might mean for a LIDA-based model of this sort of thing. So to kind of break down...
It'll be interesting to do that.
Huh?
It'll be interesting to do that.
Well, I hope that it will. So first, I'd like to kind of discuss a little bit about the way van der Kolk creates a sort of neurobiological narrative of the events that take place in the nervous system and the body of the patient who first is exposed to the traumatic event and then later develops PTSD. And so in this context, there's also kind of it's understood there's a kind of a quote-unquote normal response where someone has an adverse event and doesn't develop PTSD. So there's a kind of reference point. So the first thing I want to introduce is something that van der Kolk uses is a kind of an idea of the brain as it's put forth in the book Eye of the Vortex, From Neurons to Self by Rodolfo Llanas, which is a very interesting book. I think it's one, I'm glad I came across it in this connection because it's actually, I think, important for the rhythms hypothesis.
Yes.
His ideas about the way, he's got a very biological view of the brain, kind of rooted in kind of an evolutionary perspective. And he has some interesting theorizing regarding the role that temporal coherence and 40 hertz oscillations resonating in the thalamocortical core play in consciousness, and that's very much pertinent to the theta gamma coupling hypothesis of our model. So anyway, I'm not going to go into all of that in this talk, but it is an area for future exploration as far as I'm concerned. So one of the most basic things that brains do in Unas's brain and nervous systems is that they signal biological needs. That is most fundamental. The purpose of the brain is to enhance survival, according to this perspective, and in order to help the organism safely navigate. The movement is necessary, but random movement is quite dangerous for most organisms. And guided movement is much more effective in helping the organism attain its biological needs without succumbing to some environmental danger. So the one of the functions of brains eventually in the phylogenetic story is to map the world with regards to needs, both finding things that you want and avoiding things that will eat you, and then mobilizing in a guided fashion that map in order to best attain those needs. It should also warn the organism of dangers and opportunities, and it should do all of this in a flexible way that allows us to adapt to changes in the environment on various time scales, from like instantaneous to daily to seasonal, etc. And so this is a nice view of the brain, which I think has some interesting correspondences with the autonomous agent definition that we use for our model in terms of defining this is not for a generic autonomous agent. This is specifically for a biological one, but I think it's a very interesting point of comparison.
Steve,
Yeah.
was you not one of the participants in that workshop that Bernie and I did here?
I do not know.
Rhythms.
I'll have to look.
Somehow I suspect. Let's don't stop your talk for a minute.
Okay, no, I don't want to stop the talk, but I just want to remind us, I found this in the lab the other day, and so I want to ask you something about it before I forget. Okay, there's one nice quote from the book which I thought was very helpful. The nervous system has evolved to provide a plan, one composed of goal-oriented, mostly short-lived predictions verified by moment-to-moment sensory input. This allows a creature to move actively in a direction according to an internal reckoning, a transient sensory motor image of what may be outside. So I think that particular, has some interesting comparisons with the autonomous agent definition and our definition of mind. Okay, so this is sort of the framework in which Van der Kolk organizes his narrative of neurobiological narrative of PTSD. And another thing that he uses...
Steve, would you go back for 1 second? So that last sentence there in your quotation at the bottom, mental imagery, right?
I think so. Well, yeah. A transient sensory motor image.
Yeah, internal reckoning. Yeah.
I think, yeah, and there's the idea of the agenda, the goal-oriented, short-lived predictions, moment-to-moment sensory input, and the transient sensory motor image. That's an interesting thing. I don't know how much we've looked at that in the imagery. You've looked at that in the imagery, but the idea of actions. Maybe affordances and affordance action couplets, I don't know, as being part of the image.
So sensory motor in that sense simply means not only sensing movement within the image. That's what.
Yeah,
that's why it's sensory motor rather than just sensory.
I don't think it's just about sensing movement. Because sensing movement, that's the only way that movement is incorporated. But I think the idea of image here is the image is inherently visual, and then if we say a sensory image, it could kind of generalize it to non-visual sense
Right.
modalities.
Sure.
But then to call it sensory motor, I think links up with something that doing
Expanding it even more to include
the action part.
The action part of the agent.
It's really, and one
Okay.
might even say it's sort of.
Yeah, and there's research papers on that motor aspect of mental imagery. So if you're, for example, imagine you want to, internally simulate smacking a tennis ball, for example. You actually, they have fMRI studies of people imagining these things, and they'll actually activate certain portions of the brain that are related to those motor activities.
Supplementary
So
motor
you're
area.
actually are engaging all of those different systems in
Yep.
imagery.
And so that's part of the
Yeah.
image, yeah. So I think that's a good connection with
Would that improve with performance by any chance actually on the actual task? I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a relatively, I think, mainstream idea that you can visualize the task that you want to perform and actually improve performance. I think coaches, athletic coaches do that kind of thing with their players.
Okay, thanks for the question. That's a good question. Okay, so another key aspect of Van der Kolk's model is built on McLean's triune brain model, and we've heard this in many different forms, especially probably in terms of Kahneman System 1 and System 2. There's also Joseph Ledoux's an emotional neuroscientist. He talks about the high road, the thalamo-cortico-amygdalar pathway, and the low road, the thalamo-amygdalar pathway. McLean talks of it in terms
Did you
of
say that correctly?
the low road.
Tell me the two again, I must have missed it.
The high road is the thalamo-cortico-amygdalar
Okay,
pathway,
I'm happy with that.
and the low road is the thalamo-amygdalar.
Uh-huh.
So the cortex is
Yeah,
just
you
chopped
made it
out of
left
the
out.
low road.
Yes, well, it's evolutionarily
Right.
primitive,
That's-
and so it's pathways that kind of evolved before the cortex did.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's later pathways, and actually in the next slide, we're going to kind of look at that in a little more detail. But right now, I just kind of want to show you the basic idea. You've heard of reptilian, mammalian, and kind of primate kind of cortex or the rational brain, and this is where it comes from McLean. In a kind of a what might be accused by many of being a gross oversimplification, Van der Kolk sort of creates a cast of characters whereby he associates certain functions with certain anatomical areas. And this certainly is an oversimplification, but we're looking at a very high view because what he's trying to do is he's trying to integrate evidence from several different scientific lines of investigation. And this actually gives a pretty interesting kind of view, even if it's a 10,000 foot view. And it may not hold up, it may break down under different ways that you zoom in on it. But it is kind of a useful way of thinking about what might be happening in PTSD, and I think it may allow us to make some interesting hypotheses about how we might model such phenomena in LIDA. So one of, and from McLean, this idea of the rider and the horse, this rational brain or the cortical system, on top of the emotional brain, which is the limbic system and the lower reptilian brain. So these two pathways that originate in the thalamus, the amygdala has a smoke detector function whereby it is alert for stimuli which may represent danger. And so it has a primitive kind of PAM, if you will, that kind of can quickly classify things. And we've heard, and this is from Ledoux, I think we've heard the idea of walking in the forest on a path, and there's a stick across the path. You suddenly notice it and you jump before realizing it's only a stick and not a snake. The idea there illustrates that the thalamo-amygdalar pathway very rapidly detects the possibility of danger, a thin shape lying across the path, and activates a startle response, and then the slower pathway that goes through the cortex evaluates the object more carefully, and before you even think what's happening, you're in the air realizing it's only a snake, but you've already jumped. And that's kind of the model of the two pathways working in parallel.
Yeah. So, but this is also what we've talked about in terms of call the alarms.
Yes,
Yes.
and it also has, I think, a parallel with System 1 and System 2 in common. Okay. So the alarm system just explains the startle response.
Exactly.
And the parallel operation of the two systems is what's pertinent here, because that is what is proposed to break down in post-traumatic stress disorder. So now the thalamus here is, in van der Kolk's terminology, is called the cook. And this is an interesting concept. He points out that the typical view of the thalamus is that it's just a relay station for signals passing to the cortex. But he points out that there's a lot of reentrant circuitry in the cortex. And there's much more descending from the cortex to the thalamus than there is carrying the sensory signals to the cortex. So,
what was that? Was that like 80-20? What was the percentages?
it's different in different areas and different
okay.
sources, and it's all estimate. And
Yeah,
so
right.
it's different in different species, but yes, it's I've heard 80-20, 90-10, 95-5. I mean, the point is that there's a much greater there's the role of carrying sensory information forward has been overemphasized, and the role that it may play in integrating the senses effectively for effective perception and action is, according to van der Kolk, he calls it a cook, and this is important because of the way it behaves in PTSD on a scanner. We'll see that going forward.
Okay, so just taking that literally, so a cook takes ingredients and builds something from it.
Yes.
And so in relation to LIDA, are you thinking in terms of like the current situational model and structure building codelets, that kind of thing, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I haven't put parentheses relation to CSM.
Oh,
Maybe I should have put a question mark there, but that's exactly what I'm thinking. So,
Okay, yeah, sorry.
well, that's okay.
I just missed it on the slide.
It's very possible that, it's very possible that you're listening to me and actually, or it's possible that came in unconsciously or some
Yes,
combination of the two. Or telepathy could also be involved.
Yes.
All right, you could be a plant also. That could have been a, something
I'll never
we
tell.
previously rehearsed. Yes. Okay, so now the medial prefrontal cortex is called a watchtower. This is a midline structure that has a lot of connections to emotional areas, and it seems to have kind of he calls it a watchtower. It's like looking, the thalamus and the amygdala are a system, and I've got this little red. This is the low road. If the amygdala, there's two arrows coming out of the amygdala. One's gray and one's red. The red is the danger signal, and the gray is the all clear signal or whatever. And so in the case of the red, we've got the hypothalamus, where stress hormones get released. We got the brainstem, which connects to centers for respiration, other physiological areas, and then also spinal mechanisms are below the brainstem that regulate action, like the jump and so forth. Now this is what maybe Sherrington called the common final pathway of the motor system. The corticospinal tract is one, but the motor areas in the spinal cord, regardless of how we move, whether it's a nice calm move or it's just a sudden jump, it may come from different areas in the central nervous system, but it kind of ends up in the same place. in the peripheral nervous system. And so the medial PFC with these connections to the emotional brain typically serves as kind of a check. You know, the smoke detector goes off, you don't call the fire department. You first look to make sure it's not smoke coming from the toaster. And so that's sort of the role of the medial PFC. Now the dorsolateral PFC is a part of the prefrontal cortex that doesn't have direct connections with the emotional brain. And he calls it the timekeeper here. It's in his view, it's a part of the brain that, and there's a number of little elements of circumstantial evidence that he points to for this. It sort of has a role in what we would think of as a series of conscious broadcasts, but the kind of the creation of a sequence in time of what's happening. So it creates a story out of the successive contents of the CSM as they're available to successive broadcasts of consciousness, which is my best attempt to put his concept into the LIDA.
Okay, so it's sewing stuff together in terms of a coherent, whole, rather than saying, oh, after some certain amount of time, then call out some alarm. It's not timekeeper in that case is not saying, here's the beginning of.
No, it's not somebody with a stopwatch, and that is kind of a confusing terminology. But the way he describes it, it's more like someone who's writing a story of what happens, and kind of composing a narrative for our normal kind of. I think of it in terms of kind of like a memory of an event. It's just the way that the memory of the whole event is going to get recorded.
Or a sequence of events.
Yeah, well, you're using events in the LIDA sense. I'm using events in the common sense of like this road disaster was an event.
Got it.
So
Yep.
So and then the final piece in this little cast of characters are the midline structures, which are called by some the mohawk of self-awareness, because they're all along the midline of the brain, and they include the cingulate and some other areas that we'll look back. But the point is that there are centers in the brain that are active in order to help the brain kind of have an integrated picture of the events and one being active as an agent, as an entity in the context of that event. So, with a normal stress response, there's a kind of a story in this model, a narrative of what happens with a normal stress response. The amygdala detects a threat. There's something called the sympathetic nervous system, or the fight or flight system we'll look at again in a moment, but this is part of the autonomic nervous system. It gets activated when there's a threat. There's a secretion of hormones, norepinephrine or adrenaline, and cortisol. They have